Wow. The greatest gift you could give us would be to disappear from our family. Sarah's words still echo in my head like a deafening scream. They weren't just words. They were sharp knives pierced into the heart of someone who had always done the possible and the impossible for this family. I, Helen, mother, grandmother, and wife, lived a life of sacrifices, always putting myself second to see others thrive. Suddenly, I found myself disbelieved, devalued, treated like an intruder in my own home after giving everything I had to make others' dreams come true. But what happens when you decide, finally, to stop sacrificing? What happens when you decide that your own happiness should be a priority? I made a choice that would change my life forever. Stay until the end of this story because what happened after that sentence changed everything. Nothing will ever be the same. And if you're listening, I want to know where you're from. Leave a comment, tell me your story. And if you haven't subscribed yet, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Here, you'll find stories that, like mine, touch the heart and change lives. Don't miss what's coming next.
How life changes, my daughter. I remember that day like it was yesterday. The house that we built with so much love, Frank and I, was my refuge. And in that moment, I had in my hands the last favor I could do for Kevin and Sarah. They needed it, our house. And I needed to see my son happy. Why not? What's a few thousand reais more if my son is going to start his life with a home of his own? I didn't think twice before selling the house that had been the center of our family. I gave everything, 92,000 reais, just to see them smiling with a little place to call their own. But the question is, did they know the price of this? Did they know how much I was letting go for their happiness to bloom? I who saw the house turn into a memory, while the smell of coffee at the end of the morning seemed to disappear, just like the memories that were left behind. Meanwhile, Sarah began to get closer and closer, but not out of affection, no. I felt it. Every time she smiled, that cold smile, I felt something breaking inside of me. I was there, in every corner of the house, giving my energy, my time, while she, quietly, took control of everything. Every detail of the wedding that I, with so much sacrifice, was helping to finance. How could someone who called me mother now treat me like a burden? And Kevin, always sitting on the fence, never taking sides. I woke up that morning, saw the fresh flowers in the garden, and asked myself, was it all worth it? I knew something was about to happen. I knew my heart wasn't wrong. And it was that afternoon, after a long day, that Sarah said the words that cut me like a knife. The biggest gift you could give us would be if you disappeared from our family, she said with a smile on her face, as if it were all so simple. But what Sarah didn't know is that behind all my losses and sacrifices, I still had something she didn't imagine. Dignity. I looked at her and realized it was time to do something for myself. What would I do now? How dare she ask me to leave? The pain was great, but the anger was greater. I knew that from that moment on, my life would never be the same. And honestly, I don't even know if I'm ready for the decision I made.
Kevin and Sarah's wedding was approaching, and I, as always, was there, behind the scenes, trying to make sure everything was perfect. The flowers, the decorations, the invitations.
I was involved in everything, trying to keep a smile on my face because deep down, I believed this day would be the moment to see my son happiest. However, something inside me already knew that the perfection Sarah and Kevin were expecting was not something I could offer. Not because I didn't want to, but because what they were asking for was beyond me. Sarah was becoming more and more difficult to deal with. If it wasn't the placement of the flowers, it was the color of the tablecloths or the music for the reception. Nothing was right. I tried, with all the patience I had left, to please her. After all, it was my son's wedding, the day when everything should be magical. But amid so many demands, I started to feel invisible. They didn't see the effort, the dedication, and worse, they didn't see the sacrifice. I wondered, would they ever realize how much it hurt to be there, trying to please, while feeling more and more distant, almost like a guest in my own son's life? The weight of the hours spent preparing everything, the sleepless nights arranging the flowers, seemed invisible to their eyes. How could I have been so blind, my God? Kevin seemed distant, as if he were living in another world, away from me, almost like a stranger. I, who loved him so much, who saw him grow up, now felt the coldness of a wall between us. He, who used to come to me for advice, now seemed to just want me to stay in my corner. What happened to my son? The noise of conversations and laughter in the living room made me anxious as I adjusted another pillow, watching them from afar. A mother's love. Is it always like this? Unconditional and yet ignored? A part of me still believed that love would make everything right, but the other part knew that something was about to change forever. I didn't know it yet, but I already felt that the future of everyone there was at stake.
I can still hear those words echoing inside my head. Sarah, with that cold smile on her face, turning to me and saying, without any shame, "The biggest gift you could give us would be to disappear from our family." It sounded like a death sentence, a blow that came from where I least expected it. But contrary to what she might have thought, I didn't fall into tears. No. Instead, I felt something ignite within me, something that had been buried for so long and now seemed to have found its voice. How dare she? How could someone I considered my daughter speak to me like that after everything I had done for her and Kevin? In that instant, all I wanted was to stay silent and disappear, just like she wished. Deep down, I knew she was tired of me, tired of my presence. But what I didn't know was what would happen next. How could someone who once called me mother now treat me like an intruder? Did the unconditional love I had always given my son mean so little? A deep pain settled in my chest, but something inside me told me it wouldn't end this way. I wouldn't allow my story to end like this. It wouldn't be a story of abandonment or betrayal. It would be a story of redemption. Right then and there, I decided I would no longer be the supporting character in this plot. The house was silent now, with all the sounds from before, laughter and noise, fading away, leaving only an emptiness. I grabbed my purse and walked out the door. The smell of food in the kitchen still lingered in the air, but I didn't care. I knew what I was about to do would change everything. I went to my car, not looking back, and called my lawyer. It was time to claim what was mine, and no one else would make a fool of me. I didn't know what awaited me, but I was ready to face anything. I was determined. I was ready to leave. Every step I took toward my room, toward packing my bags, made me feel as though I were freeing myself from a prison, but at the same time, the weight of abandonment seemed to suffocate me. It was ironic, wasn't it? I was leaving, but my departure wouldn't just be physical. I knew, deep down, that my absence wouldn't just be an absence. There was something much deeper behind it. They wanted me to disappear, to vanish from their lives. And I was about to give them exactly what they wanted. But as I folded my clothes and placed them in my suitcase, my heart tightened. How could someone who once called me mother now treat me with indifference? I looked out the window from my room where the sunlight gently entered, illuminating the corners of the house, now empty of meaning. The smell of roses that Sarah had insisted on placing in every corner of the house was making me nauseous. I went to the mirror, looked at myself, and for a moment, I barely recognized the woman reflected there. Did she recognize herself? I, who had always felt so full of life, now saw myself as a burden? But it wouldn't be like that anymore. It wouldn't be the last time I made a sacrifice, but it would be the last time I let myself be trampled. When I finally finished packing my things, the sound of the phone ringing interrupted me. Kevin, my son. I knew what he wanted. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew something was wrong. I could hear the urgency in his voice. But what could he do? What would he do? I had given everything, even my soul, and got nothing in return. The decision was made. No more listening to his empty words of affection. No more feeling the weight of his false gratitude. My fate was already sealed. It was time to do what I needed to do. I didn't know where this would lead me, but I was ready.
I didn't know what to expect, but I knew something had changed inside me. When I called Patricia, my trusted lawyer, to tell her what was happening, I had no idea that my life was about to take such a huge turn. She had always been a woman of few words, but in that moment, I heard a different tone in her voice. "Helen," she said, "what you're doing is more than just an act of bravery. It's your right." I, who had been feeling like just an abandoned woman with no value, could barely understand what she was saying. Patricia asked me to come to her office as soon as possible. Something in my intuition told me that the answers I was looking for were right there in front of me. I couldn't keep feeling invisible anymore, not after what Sarah and Kevin had said to me. When I walked into Patricia's office, the atmosphere was cold, but her eyes were firm as always. She looked at me with a subtle smile and immediately pulled out a stack of papers. "You have more power than you think," she said. And there, in those yellowed sheets, were the documents I had never noticed. "You own 38% of the property," she stated. "Your contribution to the house wasn't a gift, Helen. It was an investment." My mind spun, trying to absorb those words. I had a legal stake in that house, in that life that no longer seemed to belong to me. How could I have been so naive? All those years, thinking I was doing a favor, giving everything I could. And now, the truth was right there, naked and raw. It wasn't about being abandoned or despised anymore. I had a chance to reclaim what was mine, to reclaim my dignity. I stood there, silently, listening to Patricia's words fitting into the puzzle my life had become. I had power, but until now, I hadn't realized it. The silence in the conference room felt heavy, but at the same time, it gave me a sense of lightness, as if I were finally seeing things clearly. How could I, at any point, allow them to treat me as a burden? They were about to discover that my decision to disappear didn't mean leaving everything behind. It meant taking a step toward my truth, toward my freedom, and in doing so, I would transform all the pain into something greater. I knew I was just beginning to write my own destiny.
When I left Patricia's office, the sun was already beginning to set, coloring the sky with a golden hue that seemed to reflect in my soul. I didn't know what the future held for me, but now I had something that had once seemed so distant, Control. The decision had been made, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was the author of my own story. Deep down, I knew that everything I had done, all the sacrifices, all the sleepless nights, had led me to this point, but now I needed to walk alone. The weight of responsibility was no longer just mine, but also Kevin's and Sarah's. It was their time to learn what I had learned over the years. Nothing comes for free, and choices have a price. I moved to a simple hotel, nothing luxurious, but it provided a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. The smell of freshly brewed coffee in the hallway calmed me. The sound of distant conversations, soft and discreet, reminded me that the world still turned, that life went on, even though I was away from the place that had always been my home. I could hear the wind whispering through the slightly open windows, and somehow it seemed to bring with it the answer to all my doubts. Did I do the right thing? I asked myself as I arranged my clothes in the closet of my new room. The answer wasn't within me, but in what would happen next. I needed some time, a breather, to see what Kevin and Sarah would do with the consequences of their actions. It was in this silence that I began to rediscover myself. With each passing day, a piece of me returned. I remembered who I was before I got lost in others, before I sacrificed so much that I forgot my own worth. I no longer had the house, no longer had the certainties I once had, but I had my dignity. I looked at the phone, which rang occasionally, but I never answered. What did they want from me? I realized that instead of waiting for answers from them, I was now waiting for my own actions. I knew their future no longer depended on me, but mine. My future was my responsibility, and I was ready to rewrite it.
Kevin and Sarah, who had been so relieved by my departure, began to feel the weight of my absence. I knew they had no idea what would come next. The phone rang in my new home, or rather, in my new space of freedom, and even though I knew who was on the other side, I didn't answer. I needed to give them time to understand the consequences of what they had said, to see if, somehow, they would regret it or understand the gravity of what they had done. The sound of the phone ringing echoed through the house, as if calling attention to something important. And I knew, deep down, that it was. But it was no longer my time to do things for them. They, in turn, were in panic. I could imagine them running around the house they now had, not knowing what to do. Sarah, always so organized when it came to appearances, now found herself lost in a sea of uncertainties. The perfect wedding was falling apart right before my eyes, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. And Kevin, my son, always so sensitive, now stood alone before a future that seemed uncertain. Knowing him as I did, he must have been desperate. I knew he loved me, but did he love me enough to understand the sacrifice I had made? Not just financial, but emotional. Would the pain he was feeling now open his eyes to what he had caused me? In that silence, one question stood out. Was I doing the right thing? Was I taking the right path? The following days showed me that the absence, no matter how painful, was starting to move the pieces of the game. The tension was in the air, hovering, and doubt spread through the house I had helped build. The sounds of distant conversations, of arguments that began to grow more frequent, made me feel a mixture of relief and sadness. I was out, but I still felt like my presence was somehow being felt. What would they do with that? What would become of our family now? They were about to learn a lesson that only pain can teach. Kevin had always been the type of son who, even when he made the wrong choices, would try to justify them with an excuse or a smile. But that morning, when he called me, the tone in his voice was different. He didn't just want to convince me to come back. He seemed to want to understand. "Mom, I don't know what to do anymore," he said, his voice cracking, something he had never allowed me to hear before. I listened to the silence behind his words,
and realized that for the first time, Kevin was starting to see things differently. He was lost, as if life had become a maze and he couldn't find the way out. The noise of the city, the voices in the background, seemed more and more distant, as if we were in separate worlds. "Mom, please, tell me what to do now," he pleaded. But what could I say? That request made me reflect deeply. How did he get to this point? How had the man I raised, the one who had so much love and wisdom, now found himself there, not knowing where to step? I knew he wasn't the only one to blame, but deep down, he too was responsible for everything that had happened. What happened to the boy who, as a child, asked me about the world with such enthusiasm? What would I have told him if I had given him advice? The sound of the phone in my ear brought me back to reality. He needed me, and I couldn't just be the mother who always forgave. I needed to be more. I needed to be firm and show him that not all pain can be erased with sweet words. I knew his pain was real, but was he ready to face the truth? Would he, in the end, learn the responsibility I had failed to teach him? I didn't want to be cruel, but life sometimes requires us to be. It would no longer be possible to let things drag on. I needed Kevin to see reality, and maybe, just maybe, that would help him grow. It wasn't easy, but I knew that in some way he needed to get lost to find himself, and I couldn't be the safety net this time.
Sarah, somehow, had always managed to appear strong in difficult times. But that morning, it seemed like something inside her had broken. The phone rang, and hearing her voice, I felt a tension in the air, a vulnerability I had never heard before. "Helen, please," she begged with a contained cry. "I don't know what to do. Everything is falling apart. Everything." I could hear the desperation in her words. She, who had always been so cold, now sounded like a lost child, directionless. Sarah had never been one to show weakness. She was always the strong woman, the one who took charge of the situation. But here, in this moment, she was nothing more than a woman watching the house we built crumble around her. And, as much as I wanted to be cruel and say, "You reaped what you sowed," something inside me told me to listen, at least for a moment. In that call, she was shedding her facade. The words coming from her mouth were fragile, as if the weight of it all was finally falling on her shoulders. I didn't want things to come to this. I didn't want everything to fall apart. "Not like this," she said, the words sounding broken. Something inside me broke when I heard that, even though reason told me not to let myself be swayed by her momentary fragility. But how could I not care? I, who had always treated her like my daughter, couldn't just ignore her pain, even knowing that she herself had dug the hole. It was a painful dilemma, because I knew that my help might be Sarah's last chance to save her marriage. But I also knew that, at some point, she would need to face the consequences of her choices. I knew Sarah was desperate, and for the first time I found myself in a position where I could be more than the mother who always gave in. The sacrifice, the effort, the sleepless nights, now all of that made sense. But I also knew I couldn't be their savior anymore. I listened to her until the end, but something inside me had already made up its mind. The truth could no longer be ignored. Was Sarah ready to face the truth, or would it be easier for her to blame others? The future, as always, lay before me, and I knew that my decision now would define not only her fate, but mine as well. After hearing Sarah's cry, something changed inside me. Part of me wanted to comfort her as a mother does, but another part knew that what she really needed wasn't consolation, but a reality check. Kevin called me right after, calmer, but still desperate. "Mom, you have to come back. Sarah is ruining everything. She can't handle the pressure, and I can't either." The sound of his voice reminded me of the boy I had always loved, but at the same time, it made me see the man he had become, weak in the face of his first real difficulty. I took a deep breath, my chest tight,
and with a calmness I didn't know I had, I replied, "Kevin, I can't go back. The decision is made." And with that, I felt the weight of the truth finally falling on both of them. They were desperate, trying to find a way to fix what could no longer be fixed. But the question I kept asking myself was, after everything, would they really change? I had helped them so much, sacrificed so much, and now what did I see? They saw themselves as victims of the situation. Would they finally learn what responsibility means? What it means to take care of their own debts, financial or emotional? I wanted to help, of course, but I couldn't be their salvation. Not anymore. I needed to follow my own path, the path of self-sufficiency, where the only person who depended on me was me. Kevin asked me to come back home, offering a payment plan as if that would fix everything. But how could I accept that? How could I go back to that place, which instead of being a home, had made me feel like a burden? I couldn't anymore. I needed them to understand that life wasn't a blank check, that my support wasn't infinite. They needed to learn to live with their choices. No, Kevin. If you want to fix things, you need to do it on your own. I've done all I could, I said firmly. He was silent for a moment, and the sound of the clock in the background seemed to mark the time, as if to say that perhaps it was too late to go back.
With the silence that followed my decision, a sense of peace took over me, but there was also a weight. I knew that my choice would not be easy for Kevin and Sarah to digest. They were used to seeing me as someone who could always fix their mistakes, a kind of shield against the consequences of life. But no more. I was tired of being their problem solver, tired of being the pillar in every difficulty that came their way. What I really wanted now was for them to see how much I had been exploited, how my generosity had been confused with weakness. I sat on the couch in my hotel room, looking out the window as the city lights slowly faded. The silence that filled the room seemed to scream in my ears. I no longer felt anger or frustration. What I felt was a sense of liberation, but also sadness. I didn't want to be the absent mother, the woman who turned her back on her own family. But the truth was that with every sacrifice I made, I felt I was drifting further away from myself. "Why did you let it go this far?" I thought, in a whisper. It wasn't just about money nor about the house. It was about how much I allowed them to use me without ever questioning me. Was their love for me only conditional on what I could offer? That night, my mind was restless. I knew that at some point, I would have to be the villain in their eyes. They would see what they were losing, but I knew it would be necessary. If I turned back now, it would be another sign that there were no limits, that things could go back to the way they were before, when they ignored how much I was sacrificing for them. My decision was made, but deep down, I wondered, how far could I go with this? How could someone who loved so much become so firm, so distant? I no longer knew where the sacrifice ended and where my own happiness began. The following days were filled with a heavy and constant silence. Sarah and Kevin, who had once always been around me, now seemed to drift even further apart, as if the absence of my physical presence had already caused cracks in their relationship. The conversations that used to be frequent were now brief and emotionless. The laughter that filled the house had turned into nothing more than low murmurs, muffled by the tension. I knew they were trying to cope with the weight of my decision, but I also knew that this distance was necessary. I needed them to feel the pain of losing what, for so long, they had taken for granted. The sound of the phone ringing still haunted me, but now, unlike before, I didn't care. Every time it rang, I would look at the screen and let the call go unanswered. It was no longer my responsibility to solve their problems. It was no longer my job.
I felt the weight of having always been the answer, the salvation for every dilemma that came up. However, by stepping away, something inside me began to heal. I, who had always lived for others, now needed to live for myself. The loneliness was hard, but it wasn't the worst thing in the world. On the contrary, it gave me the chance to breathe, to rediscover myself. But the pain wasn't just mine. Kevin and Sarah were now facing a mirror, and the reflection they saw was not pleasant. They were there, trying to find a way to deal with the emptiness I had left, but it was evident they didn't know where to begin. How did we get here? How could a family fall apart so quickly? Was it just my fault for allowing this to happen, or did they also carry part of this burden? I no longer knew the answer. What I did know, however, is that my choice had been made. I would not go back. The house we built, the future I dreamed for all of us, was now crumbling before me. But deep down in my heart, I knew this was what needed to happen so that we could all, including me, grow.
When I made the decision to put the house up for sale, a sense of relief washed over me, but also something heavy, as if a great storm were about to form. The house, which had once been the center of our life, was now just a piece of a game that I was beginning to understand better. The phone rang, but this time I didn't care anymore. I knew the following days would be decisive. Kevin and Sarah were starting to realize the gravity of the situation, and although they tried not to show it, it was obvious they were in panic. Their fate, like mine, was now out of their hands. The decision was made. The house, that symbol of everything we were and that once united them, was now on the market, and I couldn't turn back. I found myself in a new setting. That place, which had once made me feel part of a story, now seemed so distant. The living room, with its walls that had so often been the stage of family gatherings, was empty of meaning. I, who had always seen myself as the guardian of the family, now saw myself as a spectator. The sight of the real estate market and the sale papers brought me a sense of renewal. It was a big change, a step toward my own freedom. But at the same time, the nostalgia for everything the house represented seemed to smother my decision a little. I knew that by selling the house, I was also selling a part of myself. But what was I really selling? Was it my identity as a mother, or the hope that, with time, the pain would dissipate? I watched the house through the window, with the sound of cars passing outside, and wondered what Kevin and Sarah would do now. Would they be able to move on without the support I had always given them? Would life, in fact, force them to become responsible? The answer would come, not the next day, but in the following weeks, as the truth began to unfold before them. I already knew it was coming, but what about them? Were they ready for the reality that was approaching? The market was starting to heat up, and soon the house would be sold. The only thing left was to see how Kevin and Sarah would face the weight of this decision. The days following the sale of the house passed strangely. I was already accustomed to the solitude of my new space, but what unsettled me was the constant silence in the missed calls from Kevin and Sarah. They still hadn't understood the gravity of the situation, and I knew that sooner or later they would come after me. I didn't know if I was ready to listen to them, but what else could I do? I found myself, once again, facing a dilemma. What would happen when the sale was finalized, when the reality of losing what remained of what we had helped build finally hit them? It didn't take long for Sarah to call, once again with her usually firm voice, but this time, something different lingered in her tone. She seemed broken, vulnerable. Something in me calmed as I heard her voice tremble for the first time, and I knew that the weight of her words was starting to manifest. "Please, Helen," she began, not knowing how the words would come out. I didn't want this to happen, not like this. I know I hurt you." Her voice was laden with regret, something I hadn't expected to hear from Sarah. She, who had always been so tough, now sounded like a desperate woman.
It stirred something in me in a way I hadn't imagined, but at the same time, what I wanted most was for her to show me more than just empty words. Had she truly changed? Or was it just another manipulation disguised as regret? I knew her heart was shattered, but at the same time, I knew that it couldn't be enough to erase the damage done. The pain I felt wouldn't go away with apologies, and she knew that. "You used me, Sarah," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You used my generosity as if it were something you deserved, without ever understanding the sacrifice behind it." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. I could imagine her, sitting in some corner of the empty house, not knowing what to say. I, who had always welcomed her with unconditional love, now found myself forced to set a boundary I never thought I'd have to impose. Her words were filled with painful sincerity, but would that be enough for me to open the door again? I didn't know, and until she showed me more, I couldn't take that step. The price of forgiveness would be higher than she imagined.
The financial crisis reached a point where there was no room for negotiation anymore. What once seemed like a simple solution had now become an impossible mountain to climb. Sarah and Kevin, who for so long had lived in the shadow of my generosity, began to feel the weight of reality. I knew the house would be sold, but what still surprised me was how they were reacting to this loss. It was as if for so long they had believed I would always be there, ready to save them. But the truth was that money doesn't fix everything. And now I saw the look of desperation on their faces, trying, unsuccessfully, to make the numbers work. There was no way out anymore, and I knew the blame was theirs, but I couldn't help but wonder, could I have done more to prepare them for this? The phone rang more times, but with each call, a feeling that all of this was already beyond my control overwhelmed me. The sound of Sarah, trying to explain and at the same time begging, no longer had the same effect. I no longer cared about the pleas she was making because I knew that the only thing that truly mattered now was the lesson they needed to learn. And when Kevin finally called, his voice was so loaded with frustration that I almost felt compassion. "Mom, we can't lose the house. We can't cover the debts anymore. What are we going to do?" I knew he was desperate, but the answer I had wasn't what he wanted to hear. "You made a fatal mistake, Kevin. I warned you, and now the consequences are here. I can't be the solution for the mistakes you made anymore. It's time for you to face reality," I said, colder than I expected. There was something inside me that hardened when I uttered those words, a silent strength I didn't know I had. He fell silent, and I could hear his sigh, but I couldn't go back. The only thing I could do now was watch what would happen next. I knew this would be the last time I would have to set this boundary, and somehow that gave me peace. Because no matter how much I loved my son, I knew that true love isn't always made of easy forgiveness. It was time for Kevin and Sarah to learn, on their own, the value of responsibility. The phone rang again, and this time it wasn't Kevin or Sarah. The number on the screen caused me a slight sense of surprise. It was Jennifer, Sarah's mother. I knew she was aware of what was happening, but I didn't expect her to reach out to me. When I answered, the sound of her voice, soft but firm, made me feel something I wasn't used to, understanding. "Helen, I don't know what's happening with my daughter, but I know you're right. I saw everything happen and I did nothing," she said, with a sincerity that made me pause for a moment. Jennifer, always so distant from everything, now seemed broken, as if the weight of guilt had finally reached her heart. I knew the relationship between them hadn't been easy, but hearing these words from Jennifer made me feel, for a moment, less alone in this story. She continued, apologizing for never having intervened, for never having seen Sarah's flaws as clearly as she did now. "Helen, please, tell me what I can do. I don't want things to end like this. I want to help." The tone of her voice was desperate,
and something inside me broke. How could someone who had always kept her distance now come to me asking for help? But at the same time, the question that hung in the air was, how far could I give in? Jennifer might just be another person trying to fix the mistakes she helped create, but her visit made me think of something bigger. Could this be the moment to try rebuilding a bridge, or would it be another trap disguised as kindness? She invited me to meet and attempt to talk and perhaps even seek a solution to the crisis. But what I really wanted to see was how far she was willing to go to face the consequences of her own mistakes. I knew that with time, the truth always comes to light, and Jennifer's visit made me realize that no matter how complicated things had always been between us, we now had something in common: the need to deal with the pain of the past. Would it be possible to find a way to understand each other's pain? I didn't know, but Jennifer's visit, with all her intentions, made me reflect on how far others' responsibility stretched, and how my own responsibility was now being tested in ways I had never imagined.
Jennifer, after insisting so determinedly, finally sat down with me in a discreet cafe in the city center. I didn't know what to expect from her, but part of me, which still believed in some form of repair, wondered if this visit could be the beginning of a real reconciliation. When she sat across from me, she looked so different from the woman I had always known. Her eyes were more tired, her voice softer, as if the weight of her own choices had worn her down. She took a deep breath, looking at me with an expression I couldn't identify: regret, frustration, maybe a mix of both. I know I can't fix what happened, Helen. I see now, more than ever, the mistake I made by not supporting you, by not supporting my daughter in a stronger way. But I don't want to lose the opportunity to try to do something. Maybe I can still help somehow. Her words, though laden with pain, couldn't disguise the emptiness of her intentions. How could someone like her, who had had so many opportunities to intervene, now want to offer herself as the savior? I knew I couldn't accept, not the way she wanted. She had been complicit in this whole process, and Sarah's failures were not just hers. But at the same time, Jennifer was there, trying to redeem herself from something she perhaps couldn't explain. It was an apology that seemed as empty as the promises Sarah had made to me over the years. I, who had always been willing to forgive, now found myself facing a choice that would make me stronger. "Jennifer," I said calmly, looking into her eyes, "you can try to fix the mistakes you made with Sarah, but I can't be responsible for that. It's time for each of us to bear the consequences of what we've done." The silence between us was long, as if the weight of my words had fallen on her. I knew this would be hard for her to accept, but the truth was there, bare and raw. It was no longer about helping those who hadn't learned to help themselves, nor about saving those who repeatedly chose not to learn from their own mistakes. Helping, Jennifer, doesn't always mean fixing. Sometimes helping is allowing people to face the pain they've caused so they can finally grow. The expression on her face said more than any words could. She knew I was right. But what did that mean for both of us? I didn't have all the answers, but at that table, I made my final choice. I could no longer carry the consequences of others. The days passed, and life continued its relentless march. Kevin and Sarah were finally starting to understand the gravity of the situation. The sale of the house was approaching, and reality was knocking at the door, like a storm that cannot be avoided. I watched everything from a distance, but I knew the time had come to teach the hardest lesson of all: true responsibility. And I, who had always been a woman who forgave, who gave second chances, now found myself as the one who would have to be firm, maybe even a little harsh, so they could understand what was truly important. What I had done for them, what I had given my life to build, was not something that could simply be returned or forgotten. I knew that, at some point, words would no longer be enough. Action would be required. So, I began to do what I should have done a long time ago. Show them the reality of a life without the crutches I had always given them. Helping them now meant letting them live with their own choices. No, it wouldn't be easy. Seeing Kevin struggling, running after a solution for the debts, seeing Sarah starting to work on something she would never have considered before, was a painful process. But it was necessary. I wasn't doing this to punish them, nor to take revenge. I was doing it because, deep down, I knew they needed it. They needed to understand that life doesn't offer shortcuts, and that true love is not made of endless sacrifices. True love requires respect, dignity, and above all, responsibility. And so, as time passed, I saw the transformation happen. Not immediately, of course. Real change takes time. But finally, there was something new between us, something more genuine. I, who had so often felt forgotten, now saw my son and my daughter-in-law facing their difficulties head-on. And although there was still much to be done, I knew that this process was necessary. The pain of loss, the shame of wrong choices, was now serving a greater purpose. They were beginning to understand the true value of things. And finally, I felt like I was living for myself, without guilt, without weight. I could breathe, and that, in itself, was already a victory.
The path I've traveled to get here hasn't been easy, but when I look back, I see that it was necessary. Kevin and Sarah began to find their own ways, finally facing life with the courage I always knew they had, but never knew how to access. I, who once supported them, now saw them supporting themselves, struggling to get it right, even though their failures were still visible. Time had shown me that true transformation didn't come from the outside in, but from the inside out. They were finally understanding the value of what they had lost, and I silently watched, with a sense of relief in my chest. Sarah, who once seemed lost and dependent, was now starting to rise. She found a job. It wasn't her dream job, but it was hers, and that seemed to make all the difference. I could see a new expression on her face, something that had been missing before: responsibility. She was no longer the woman hiding behind the comfort of others. She was finally learning what it meant to make her own choices without the safety net I had always been willing to provide. I knew the road ahead for her would be long, but this was the beginning of something new, and I felt at peace, knowing that, at least for now, she was on the right path. Kevin was changing too. He started working harder than ever, no longer just to solve his debts, but to rebuild his life in a way he had never imagined before. I saw in him a stronger, more responsible man who was beginning to accept the consequences of his choices. And although there were still moments of frustration and mistakes, there was something more now: hope. He was learning to live with what he had and not with what he thought he deserved. I, who had always dreamed of a future where my family would be united and happy, now saw that, in some way, I was achieving that, but in a way I had never imagined. They were finally learning to be the masters of their own destinies. And me? I was finally learning to live for myself. I was sitting in my new apartment, having a cup of tea and watching the busy street outside when the phone rang. It was Sarah. No, it wasn't a desperate call nor a plea like before. Her voice was different, more firm, more mature. "Helen, I really want to apologize," she began, and for a moment, the words got stuck in my throat. As someone who had always been in the background, someone who had sacrificed so much for so long, I didn't know how to react. But at the same time, I knew this was a crucial moment for both of us. Forgiveness is often the key to true healing, and now, for the first time, Sarah was asking me for it.
I felt strangely touched, but also cautious. Did she really understand the weight of her words? I knew she was trying, and maybe that was enough. No, the apology didn't erase everything that had happened, but it indicated that she was finally beginning to understand what responsibility meant. I listened and couldn't help but let out a deep sigh, as if the air I was breathing was lighter, purer. "I forgive you, Sarah," I said in a soft voice but full of sincerity. "But more importantly, I hope you can forgive yourself, and that one day you can look at what you've done and understand what it really means to love someone without expecting anything in return." The conversation wasn't long, but it was deep. When I hung up, a weight lifted from my heart, a weight I didn't know I was carrying. Forgiveness didn't mean everything was solved, but it meant that both of us could finally move on. I knew Sarah was now on a new path, and that with time she would find her own balance. But what I most hoped for was that she would learn, as I had learned, that true love is the kind that gives without losing itself, that sacrifices without destroying itself. That was my deepest wish, and now, with forgiveness, I knew I had taken the first step towards true reconciliation.
Kevin was starting to transform right before my eyes. No, he wasn't the perfect man yet, but something in him had changed, something I couldn't ignore. He, who had always been the son who sought easy answers and quick fixes, now seemed to be embracing difficulties in a different way. He started working harder, more seriously, more disciplined. The smile he gave me was a little more confident, a little more genuine. But more than anything, I saw something that hadn't been there before: humility. He was starting to understand that life is not made of shortcuts, and that no matter how hard it was, he would need to stand on his own 2 feet. I knew this path wouldn't be easy for him, but deep down, there was something in his eyes that gave me hope. "I don't know how to thank you, Mom," he told me in one of our now more frequent conversations. "I know I failed you, and I know I hurt you, but now I'm really trying." I listened to those words, and although I knew he was just beginning to walk the right path, a part of me felt proud. Maybe finally he was understanding what it means to live with responsibility, what it means to face the consequences of his choices. Life for Kevin now seemed to have more weight, more meaning. He was no longer just moving forward, trying to make things work as he had before. He was trying to understand what it really meant to be a man. And in some way, that gave me a sense of peace. What surprised me most was how much he began to seek solutions on his own, without waiting for me to intervene. "I'm doing well, Mom. I'm handling things now." Those simple words, but filled with a new understanding, made me realize that the process of change was underway. I knew he still had a lot to learn, but finally he was taking the first steps to become the man I always knew he could be. And while the road was long, seeing that progress in Kevin made me feel that maybe, just maybe, my sacrifice had been worth it.
As time passed, the weight of all the sacrifices I made for my family began to show in a different light. I had always believed that unconditional love was the key to everything, that I would give everything I had, expecting nothing in return. But when I look at Kevin and Sarah now, trying to rise again, I begin to realize that true generosity is not just about giving, but knowing when to stop giving. I was generous with them, of course, but for how long? The more I gave, the more they expected, and the more they expected, the more I lost myself. What once seemed like an act of love was now a painful reminder of how, for so long, I had canceled myself out so they could have what they wanted. I looked at my new life with different eyes. It was no longer about what I could offer, but about what I deserved in return. I learned, in the hardest way, that generosity has a price, and that price is sometimes higher than we imagine. I was ready to pay that price, but not again. I could no longer allow my kindness to be seen as a sign of weakness. Not anymore. Kevin and Sarah were finally seeing the value of what I had done for them, But now it was time for them to learn how to live without me being the source of everything. True generosity for me was knowing when to give and when to step back, knowing when love needs boundaries so that it can truly sustain itself. I watched the transformation of both of them with a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride, because they were beginning to realize the value of responsibility, and sadness, because part of me knew that to get here, I had lost something very precious, my own identity. But looking back, I realized that without that loss, I might never have learned the most important lessons of my life. The price of generosity wasn't just financial, but emotional. And I was learning to pay that price, not with regret, but with the certainty that now I knew the value of putting myself first.
After so much time apart with unspoken tensions and resentments, the reconciliation came unexpectedly, but it was necessary. Kevin and Sarah, who once seemed so distant from me, were now beginning to understand what had been lost between us. It wasn't a grand gesture nor a big speech. There were no grand promises. It was simpler than that, a sincere conversation. I looked at Kevin, who was sitting across from me, with a more mature, more aware look. I knew he was truly trying. Sarah, who had always been more reserved, now seemed a little more open, more willing to listen than to speak. "I know we made you suffer, Mom," Kevin said, his voice cracking, which was unusual for him. "And I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for us. I really see what you sacrificed." I looked at him with a soft, almost imperceptible smile, but full of meaning. I never wanted him to feel guilty, but seeing this recognition finally happen, without being forced, without it being a demand, made me feel that, finally, my generosity had been understood. Sarah, who had always been more reserved, now seemed a little more open, more willing to listen than to speak. "I owe you an apology, Helen," Sarah began, her voice low but sincere. "I was so focused on what I wanted, what I thought I deserved, that I forgot what you truly meant to me. I'm ready to change, to do things the right way." The sincerity in her voice touched me deeply. It was no longer an empty apology. I knew that her words came from a place of real transformation. I stood up, and as I hugged her, I felt a wave of emotion wash over me. It wasn't the end of the pain, nor of the rebuilding, but it was, without a doubt, the beginning of a new phase for all of us. Reconciliation didn't happen overnight, but in that moment, I could feel that the healing process was finally underway. We were no longer the family we once were, but we were ready to become something new, something healthier. Sarah, for a long time, was a woman who hid behind her expectations and the comfort of others. But now, after so many changes and difficulties, something was beginning to sprout within her. She was no longer the woman who depended on others to feel safe. The job she found wasn't what she had dreamed of, but it was enough for her to discover that she was capable of living with her own efforts. I saw a transformation in her, subtle but powerful. I watched her, in the days that followed, with more respect than I had ever imagined possible. With every step she took towards her own future, I could see that, in some way, she was starting to build the life she had always meant to live. She began talking more about her dreams, her ambitions, and for the first time, she seemed to have a purpose. I, who had always worried so much about her future, now saw a stronger, more confident woman. It wasn't a magical transformation, and I knew she would still face many challenges ahead, but in that moment, I realized that she had taken the first step towards freeing herself from the idea that others had to sustain her choices. She was learning to value herself, to understand that life was not a trade of favors, but a process of growth, learning, and self-building. Meanwhile, the conversations between us became deeper. Sarah talked about her insecurities,
the fears that had imprisoned her for so long. I, as a mother, had always loved her, but now I saw that our relationship was renewing, more based on respect and understanding than the desire to please. It was as if she had finally found the path, the one that, instead of leaning on others, encouraged her to be more self-sufficient. And, even with the fear of the unknown, I knew deep down she was ready to move forward. Sarah's new path wasn't perfect, but it was hers. And I, at last, could breathe with relief knowing that she was making peace with the past, while at the same time creating a future that was truly her own. Tevin and Sarah's wedding wasn't what I had imagined, but in a way it reflected what our family had become. It was no longer the dream wedding Sarah had envisioned, full of glamour and grand parties. But as I looked at the two of them at the altar, something touched me deeply. It was the first time I saw Kevin and Sarah not as children who always needed help, but as adults with their own responsibilities and choices. It wasn't the fairy tale wedding I had imagined for them for so long, but it was the wedding they needed to grow. The ceremony, though simple, was full of meaning. I saw them, with their eyes still unsure but firm, facing a future together in a way that was more mature than any of us could have predicted. During the wedding, the exchange of vows was short but full of truth. Sarah, who had often been the more distant one, was now there with eyes full of sincerity I didn't expect. She looked at Kevin and with a firm voice said, "I'm not perfect, but I'm willing to fight for us, for what's real." And looking at him, I could see that she was speaking the truth. There was no longer that air of perfection, of waiting for a miracle. It was the acceptance that, like all of us, they would have to build what they wanted. And in that simple ceremony, I saw a kind of beauty I never thought possible. The beauty of acceptance, humility, and the courage to finally walk together with their flaws and virtues. I, who had always wished to see my family united, now realized that the love that had existed between us needed to be reconfigured, no longer with the hope that everything would be easy, but with the reality that marriage is built, day by day, with effort, forgiveness, and above all, respect. And watching Kevin and Sarah unite, not with the ideal I had always dreamed of, but with the strength of who they both were, something within me quieted. I knew that finally they were ready to live their story, not as a continuation of the past, but as something new. And in that moment, I felt at peace. Kevin and Sarah's wedding wasn't perfect, but finally, they were ready to make the best they could with what they had.
Life, after so many twists and turns, seemed to have finally found its rhythm again. I, who had for so long been the savior, the source of support, was now beginning to live for myself. No, it wasn't a life of luxury or grand adventures, but it was a life of peace, reconciliation, and above all, self-sufficiency. I no longer carried the weight of others' expectations, nor the guilt of not having given enough. And in a way, I felt a silent pleasure in knowing that I was no longer the point of reference for Kevin and Sarah's problems. They were, finally, walking on their own, facing their own difficulties. I became what I would call the gentle avenger. It wasn't revenge in the cruel sense of the word. I didn't want anyone to suffer as I had, but I also wasn't willing to be their salvation anymore. I knew that if they wanted to learn something, they would have to face their struggles head on. The pain they caused me, the indifference that hurt me so much, was now being transformed into something powerful. I learned to be gentle with myself, to forgive my own failures, and to set boundaries where there had been none before. And deep down, I knew that this was the greatest gift I could give to myself, the chance to be free without carrying the weight of mistakes that weren't mine. The world seemed to have reorganized itself around me. The little things that once seemed insignificant now took on a new meaning. I became more involved with others, with my new friendships, with my new social circle. Time, instead of making me more bitter, made me lighter.
Perhaps the big secret of life after so many losses was precisely this, the lesson of letting go, of moving forward, and finally living for oneself. And seeing Kevin and Sarah now, beginning to follow their own paths, I knew that my generosity had not been in vain. They were finally becoming the adults they had always meant to be, and I was finally becoming the woman I deserved to be. I never imagined that a simple invitation to lunch could carry so much emotion. When Sarah called me, the tone of her voice was different. There was no longer that distance, nor the coldness that always accompanied our conversations. She seemed genuinely open, and for a moment, the woman in front of me was no longer the one I had to rescue. She was someone who was finally allowing herself to be vulnerable. "Helen, I'd like you to come have lunch with me. No formalities, just the two of us, like it should have been from the beginning." The invitation was simple, but the meaning behind it, for me, was profound. When I arrived at the restaurant, Sarah was already waiting, sitting at the table with a soft smile on her face. It wasn't the forced smile from before, but something more genuine, more relaxed. When she saw me, she stood up and hugged me with sincerity I wasn't expecting. "I'm really sorry for everything, Mom. I know I never did enough for you, but today I want to start making it right." Her words touched me in a way I didn't know could happen. I, who had always been waiting for this moment, was finally living it, not with the expectation of instant healing, but with the acceptance that wounds don't heal overnight. And still, the simple fact of being there with her in that moment of truth made me feel that something good was finally happening. We sat down, ordered the simplest dish on the menu, and throughout the meal, we talked about so many things, not just about the past, but about the future, about our lives, our accomplishments, and even about our mistakes. There was a lightness in the air, as if things were finally in their proper place. I saw Sarah, for the first time, as the woman she was becoming, and not just as my daughter. It was a strange feeling, but also comforting. She was finally ready to take responsibility for her choices, and that, to me, was the greatest sign that our relationship was being rebuilt. This lunch, which started as a simple meal, was in fact the landmark of a new phase. A phase where understanding, respect, and finally, forgiveness could have the space to bloom.
I look back at everything I have lived through and realize how much my journey has shaped me. The woman I began to be, full of sacrifices and generosity, has now become a stronger, more independent woman. The pain I felt along the way was deep, but it was also what allowed me to grow. I am no longer the woman who allowed herself to be lost, the woman who sacrificed without thinking of the consequences. Now, I am someone who has learned to put myself first, to have respect for myself. And although my love for Kevin and Sarah has never changed, I now see that before loving them, I had to love myself first. My life is no longer the same. The walls of my apartment, simple and welcoming, reflect everything I've learned. I don't need grand things to feel fulfilled. The small joys of life, a hot cup of coffee in the morning, an honest conversation with a friend, the peace I found in my own company, are now the things that make me feel whole. I am a woman who, at 71, has learned to live for herself, not depending on others to find her happiness. It's no longer about fixing others' mistakes, but ensuring that I am at peace with myself. I look to the future with a sense of lightness, without the burdens I once carried. Life, with all its ups and downs, has taught me that true strength lies in the ability to start over, to let go of what no longer serves us, and move forward. Kevin and Sarah are now on their own path, and while I know there's still much to be done, I see them growing every day. And me?
I'm living my truth without regrets. The new Helen is who I am, someone who has learned to respect herself, love herself, and be kind to herself. And for the first time in a long time, I can confidently say that I'm happy with who I am. The future, with all its challenges and promises, awaits me, and I'm ready for it. Because in the end, the greatest lesson I've learned is that to be truly happy, we must first be true to ourselves. Sometimes, the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the courage to walk away from what harms us, even when the price seems high. What I've learned on this journey is that we can't live to please others at the cost of our own happiness. Life is made of choices, and when we take the reins, we begin to understand that true love lies in taking care of ourselves, without guilt, without fear. Kevin and Sarah are on the path to learning what that means, and in the end, we all come out stronger. The story continues, and the future is now a blank page waiting to be written with more wisdom and courage. If you've been touched by this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Here, stories like mine, filled with emotions and lessons, are shared to touch your heart. And remember, the greatest step toward a lighter life is knowing when it's time to move on. Don't miss out, because the best is yet to come.